evening, everyone. Good afternoon for those on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us in this webinar today on our Board of Directors training series. Our speaker today is Mr. Tony Scucci, who will be speaking to us today on the board building cycle. And once again, just before we get started, if you all can hit your it's a button that looks like a hand. If you could raise your hand if you're able to hear me. I just want to be sure that we're able to, thank you. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that everyone is able to hear us very well. So at this point, I'm actually going to turn it over to Tony, and he will be presenting for us today. And once again, also, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, if you can write them into your question box, please feel free to do so throughout the duration of the webinar, and we'll try to get the answers to those questions as soon as we can. Okay, Tony, it's open for you.
Great. Thank you, Kimberly. I really appreciate your support in this, and welcome to everybody. This is the first in a series of webinars that we're doing between now right through until August. And so just want to let you know that. And as Kimberly showed the flyer earlier, she'll put it up on the screen later. It lays out some of the other webinars as well. When we kind of thought about setting up these webinars, we realized that it's kind of a compromise. It's not as good as being there in person, and it's not as good as having a customized training, but we did our best to kind of develop the curriculum in such a way that we hope would have as much relevance for you all as possible. I also want to point out that these webinars will be archived at the NCUIH website, so you can access them anytime, probably after the next few days. And also would encourage you to encourage other board members that you work with to access them as well. It's a great place to get some good basic learning about nonprofit board service. And finally, let me just say in terms of the introduction part that on this screen that you're looking at now is my email address, and on the very last slide I put up there will be my email address. And I would invite anyone on the call to follow up this webinar if you have a question or a comment. If there's something I could be helpful with, please feel free to contact me at that email address. And if you do contact me, I will respond definitely within 24 hours. That's my way to do business. So having said all that preliminary stuff, let's just talk about what we're going to do for the next hour or so. We're going to look really at board building as a cycle. And so the first thing I think about in developing a webinar is to advance the slide, and it's not advancing. There we go. Is to think about what the goal is here. And really the goal is to really improve board performance, really for you to think about the ways in which your board is functioning, and that no matter what level you're at, to look at ways to improve that performance. Specifically, we'll look at understanding board duties, roles, and responsibilities, and we'll also look at developing strategies to build and sustain effective boards of directors. So that's where we're going. I put together an agenda to just kind of lay out the steps here. We're doing the welcoming introduction now, obviously. I think there's at least 12 people on the call, so that's a really great turnout. I don't have the little hand button on my screen, but I believe you all do. And just to get a sense of who's on the board, I'm going to ask a question. If you would just click on raise your hand. If anyone is on the call for whom this is the first time you've ever participated in a board training, if anyone fits that category, would you raise your hand? I heard one beep, so I assume, Kimberly, that means one person?
No, that's just someone joining the call.
Okay. Anyone on the call who's been on a board for less than 2 years? Raise your hand. And Kimberly, can you see the responses?
Only one person responded to the first question.
Okay, that's helpful. And I'm just trying to get a sense of where everyone is so I can customize this to the extent I possibly can to this audience. So we're doing welcomes and introduction. I'll give you a quick overview of the session. We're going to talk about this in terms of the overall duties and responsibilities. So those are really the context in which we will look at building a board. We'll look at the characteristics of high-performing boards, and we'll look at some kind of steps in the phases of a board building cycle. So that's the way I'm thinking about this, and ultimately at the end we'll link you to an evaluation form, and would really invite everyone, encourage everyone to please respond to that. I think you will get an email within an hour from Kimberly, and if you could respond, it would be very, very helpful. Every webinar we've done so far over the past several years has been informed and improved by the feedback we've gotten from people who've participated. So please do that when it comes around. There are some themes that emerge in doing this training and in virtually all the board trainings that I do. There are really 4 themes, and I want to just touch on them. One is that when we look at board performance, when you have problems with performance, there's almost always underneath that problem, the problem that the person doesn't really have a clear sense of purpose, don't really feel like they're making a difference. Or there are boards that feel like they're not sure as a body that the board is making a real difference. So it's really important to keep in mind that if your board is going to improve its performance, everyone on your board and your board as a whole needs to feel a real sense of purpose, like, yes, I am making a difference. When I give up my personal time and come to a board meeting, it's going to make a difference out there for the people that we serve. So that's one of the themes. The second theme really has to do with the idea of attending or paying attention. We do a lot of things on autopilot. Boards of directors do a lot of their work really without being very intentional. And what makes for an improvement would be to step out of that autopilot mode. If you continue to work in autopilot, there's no way your performance can improve. So getting out of autopilot is an important step, first step. And the way we get out of autopilot, there are many ways. One way is simply by participating in a webinar like this, having a board retreat. Bringing on a new person to the board often gets you out of autopilot, because when you bring on a new person, they tend to ask new questions that some of the veteran board members may not even think of. Other things get boards out of autopilot that are not so positive. A crisis is one sure way to get your board out of autopilot. So we don't want to have that happen. We want to have your board becoming more intentional about the way it does its work in a planful way. A third kind of theme that will run throughout this webinar is that when you're dealing with any kind of problems at the board level, the tendency is to focus outside of yourself. Much more helpful to focus on yourself as a board or a board chairperson. If you have a problem with your board, let's say, for example, you have a problem with attendance. People are not coming to the board meetings, which is a common kind of problem. The most helpful thing to do is to ask yourself the question, what is it about our board meetings that's causing this to happen? Maybe our board meetings are not very interesting. Maybe they're boring. Maybe we're having our board meetings at the wrong time of day and folks cannot get to them. Whatever the reasons may be, by focusing on how you may be implicated is the only way to begin changing it so you can make an improvement. And the last theme I want to touch on that's very relevant to this workshop, and that's the notion of the word board. And we're talking about a board building cycle here, and the key word is that it's a cycle. It's not stagnant. It's a dynamic thing. Think about your board not as a noun, but as a verb. It's an action word. It's a dynamic thing. There is always coming, there are always goings. Your board is always growing and developing, and you're always working towards becoming a more and more effective board. So these themes will emerge as we kind of go through this workshop. Let me ask a question of folks to reflect on. And the first question is 2 questions here. One is I'd like you to think about your board in particular, and just reflect for a moment. What are 2 or 3 notable strengths, certain qualities about your board that you think are really positive and really notable? And just reflect on that for a moment. Make a note to yourself if you like. What is it about your board that energizes you, that makes you feel like, yes, this is something we do really well? And now I'd like to ask you one other question, and I'd like you to respond to this question in the chat window. So as we go through this workshop, what is one area in which you think your board's performance could be improved? What's one of the weak spots in your board or the way it does its work that you think there could be some improvement? Give some thought to that throughout the webinar, and if a thought comes to your mind, if there's an area you'd like to kind of point out, if you punch it into the chat box, that'll be a way to help ensure that we can address that particular issue. So again, kind of just reflect on that, and then throughout the webinar, if something comes to your mind, put it right in that chat box. I would also invite you to ask questions anytime during this webinar. We don't have to wait till the end. The obvious, there are no such things as stupid questions. Ask a question if you have it. I will do my best to respond and to answer. So think about that, and please feel free to chat. And you don't have to. I can tell you all. I am not a typist. I type with two fingers. You don't have to be a fancy typist. Don't worry about typos or spelling. If you have a question, just please put it in. So I'll begin, and we'll look at defining governance. So what is governance? And it really has to do with steering or controlling or influencing from a position of authority. Steering and influencing are ideas that go way beyond simply oversight. So your board of directors may do a really good job in terms of oversight functions. Boards can do much more than just provide oversight. Boards can also bring strategic thinking to the organization. But think about your board as steering or controlling or influencing from a position of authority. And authority is one of those terms, too, to keep in mind that sometimes people who serve on boards think they have some kind of authority, when in fact, no one individual board member has any authority. The authority you have comes from the collective of the board. So it's something to think about. And I just got something about fundraising, so I see that. Thank you, Kimberly. One other thing I'll just say about serving on a board, and that is you are really in a place where you're entrusted with the well-being of your organization. You're entrusted with someone else's money to advance your mission and to do it in a way that's wise and frugal. So the idea of being a trustee on your board is a good way to think about your service on the board. You're volunteering, of course, you're volunteering your time and your energy, but in addition to that and beyond that, you are one of the kind of owners of the organization, somebody who has a major responsibility to look out for the best interests of your organization. I thought it'd be helpful to look at some characteristics of boards that are functioning at high levels, and you can compare and contrast your board to some of these characteristics. Mission-focused. Boards that perform at a high level are mission-focused. That means when boards meet, they talk about the mission, they talk about the people they serve, they talk about their values. Mission-focused. Boards that function at a high level are clear about their duties, roles, and responsibilities. Is your board, is every board member clear about what their duties, roles, and responsibilities are? It's a good question. Boards that are comprised strategically, that you simply don't go out and get warm bodies, but you think about the kind of folks that you need to help advance your mission, and you recruit people that way. A strategic way of putting your board together. Small enough to deliberate effectively. If your board is too large, it's very difficult to deliberate effectively. You've got to have enough people with enough different viewpoints and ideas to make good decisions, but also at the same time, you can't have too many people because you will never be able to make decisions. Everybody on the board is engaged. Everyone brings value. And if you think about that theme I mentioned earlier about feeling a sense of purpose, if you bring someone onto the board and they feel like they're making a difference, they're going to engage. Agendas that are future-oriented. Think about the last time your board met. How much time did you spend talking about what you're going to do versus talking about things that have happened already? If you spend a lot of time in your board meeting listening to reports and hearing reports, you're in the past tense. You need to hear reports. You need to do the oversight work, but at the same time, you get energized when you're talking about what you're going to do, much more than what's happened already. Time is spent on the important stuff. You should not be spending time in a board meeting talking about what color to paint the office. That's stuff that you leave to your staff. The board level, you have to talk about the bigger issues. Creating an atmosphere that's conducive to dialogue, where you have different opinions and they're welcomed and they're encouraged. Boards that are functioning at a high level have a mechanism for renewal. They have a way in which new people can come on, and people who have contributed a lot can cycle off. I'm looking at some of the chat comments too. Too many labeling of items on the agenda. Okay, so we can touch on agenda management. I'm going to make a note to myself. Leadership in your board, if it's cultivated with intention, then you're looking like a board that performs at a high level. Very often I ask people who are chairs of boards how they got to be chair, and the comment very often is no one else wanted the job. Or, it was I got it because I just fell into it. Leadership has to be developed with real intention, especially if you're going to be good stewards of your organization. And the big one, and what this topic is about tending to your own growth and development. And I'm getting some other questions here too, so I'm going to respond to some of these questions in a few minutes, I think. So what we're doing today is paying attention to the growth and development of your board and looking at ways to do that. And so we're going to start by looking at in the larger context of your legal obligations and duties and responsibilities. And I'm going to go through these next few slides very quickly. They are the basics of things. As a board member, you have a responsibility to care for the organization, to be loyal, and to obey the rules you established, and the laws and the regulations and so on. These are the basic legal obligations. And caring for your organization means just using your best judgment, doing the best you can do, getting involved, asking questions. Duty of loyal has to do with conflicts of interest. These are things you want to avoid, things that could get in the way of you making good decisions on the behalf of the organization and all of its clients. And being obedient. You have a mission, staying true to your mission. You have bylaws. Those are the rules you agree to use to do your work, staying true to those. Those are the three basic legal obligations. Board roles and basic responsibilities. And what I'll put up on the slide here are the basics. These are the things that you do in terms of your roles as a board. You set the direction of the organization. You ensure that you have the resources to advance your mission. You provide oversight, which is very important, and you have your board structure and operations. Those are the four big roles that boards have. And within those roles, you have these areas of responsibility. When it comes to setting direction, it's about making sure your mission is true and it's accurate, and you're aligning all your activities with your mission. Setting direction means strategy. It means thinking about how we position our program so it's going to weather the various changes that are coming down the pike. Ensuring resources has to do with the way you present your organization to the public and about advocacy work. Ensuring resources means that your board is comprised of the right mix of folks. Oversight has to do with overseeing your programs and also the finances. These are the basic areas of responsibility, and overseeing your chief executive director. Board structure and operations have to do with the very structure of your board and your meetings. So these are the kind of things, these are the basics. If you were taking a basic training, you'd be looking at these. And this is the context in which we're going to focus on developing your board, this idea of a board building cycle. There are 5 questions that everybody on your board has to be able to answer, unequivocally. What am I expected to do? When you invite someone to come on the board, you've got to be able to answer this question. Why is it important? How do I have authority to do this job? When I need help, where can I go? And the 5th question, how am I doing so far? And if you think about these 5 questions and apply them to your work on the board, what am I expected to do is simply the job description. What are the duties and responsibilities of this job as a board member? Why is it important? That's what ties it to the mission. It's why you show up. It's why you do your work. It's why you choose to go to a board meeting rather than stay home with your family or attend to your business. It's one of the priorities in your life. Do I have authority to do it? Again, your authority comes from the collective of the whole board. When I need help, where can I go? What resources do we have to be able to advance this mission? And how am I doing so far is a question about feedback. How am I doing so far? One of the ways you can ensure that your board's performance will improve from meeting to meeting is to simply ask at the end of every meeting, how can we improve the way we meet? Give your board chair some direct feedback. Give your executive director some feedback. Feedback is really the way we get out of autopilot and get the information we need so we can improve the way we do our work. I want to talk about basic roles of the board. And there are two ways to think about this. And I would invite you to think about steering and rowing. So as you imagine your work on a board, some of it is going to have to do with steering and some of it has to do with rowing. And this comes from somebody named Bill Ryan, who's somebody at Harvard who studies nonprofits. When steering, the board sets the direction, determines the values which guide it, and ensures resources are used prudently. So you see, this is the steering of your board, of your organization. It's steering work. When you're rowing, board members can bring resources to the organization in various different ways. One is to provide pro bono professional service or expertise. I serve on a board right now that, as a board member, one of the things that I bring to the board I'm on is that I know a lot about boards and nonprofit governance. And the board I just joined is a board that needs to know more about that. So I'm doing a lot of work with this board. That's what I do in my work life, only I'm doing it pro bono. Volunteering as a frontline service provider is a way to row. It's a way to advance the organization and the mission. Helping raise funds is another one. It's not steering. You can see, as these four examples show, this is not about directing the organization anywhere. It's about pushing it forward. That's the rowing part. Rowing work is substitutable. If I wanted to do a fundraiser for your urban program, I could go out and do that and give you the money. I could go out and do that same fundraising and give it to some other organization. The fundraising work itself, that rowing work, is substitutable. Steering work is not substitutable. Steering work is the stuff that has to do with being good stewards of the organization and moving it in the various directions that it needs to be moved. So steering work is something you have to do collectively, and it's the part that has to do with moving the organization forward in the direction it needs to go. A single board member or several board members working on an individual capacity can be effective rowers. Again, you could bring together a few folks and do a fundraiser. That's a good way to be effective as a rower. But governing isn't like that. Governing is the collective act, bringing everybody together and getting to the core of governance, leading the organization. So it's a way to think about your work. In a board meeting, if you're considering some particular activity, you can ask the question, is this more about rowing or is it more about steering? If you met for a strategic planning session, that would be about steering. It would not be about rowing. If you got together to plan a fundraising activity, that would be about rowing. And this diagram may be a way to help you figure out where you might put your organization. On this north-south axis, you have going from low to high the rowing work, and from left to right, you have steering, and it goes from left to high, low to high as well. And a board that's doing a lot of steering and a lot of rowing would be up here in this quadrant. If your organization has a lot of money and you don't worry about fundraising, you might be more in this area. Your board's job is to do mostly guiding. Urban programs have a primary source of funding that you can count on, which you get through IHS and through the various third-party reimbursements that allows you to spend some time guiding, not so much having to do other kind of rowing work. So it's a grid there that you can, if it helps you to kind of plug yourself in somewhere and think about, you may find a use for this at a board meeting as well. Individual board member responsibilities. These are the kind of generic things you see in any board training. Actively participating, being informed. These are the things that you need to be doing if you're going to be an effective board member. I'm going to talk about the board building cycle, and before I do that, let me respond to a couple of questions that have come through, and not in any particular order, but I will just respond to them. If you'd like more of a response or more in-depth response, if you ask one of these questions, please feel free to email me, and I will definitely get back to you. Probably going from the last to the first, somebody talked about the need for there to be real communication between board members between meetings. And I will tell you that across the country, nonprofit boards talk about this all the time. Board members consistently say they need more time to be in touch with other board members, having real conversations about real issues affecting the organization. We have the technology now to allow that to happen. It's a good question to ask at a board meeting. How can we be more connected to each other between board meetings? Are there ways we can do that? Are we using the technology in a way that's wise and getting us the maximum results? So it's just a kind of quick comments about communicating between meetings, and it's important to do that because it builds relationships. Serving on a board is not just showing up, in your hat and tie. You are a whole person sitting down with other people with different viewpoints and different experiences, and you have to build those relationships. The work gets done in the context of relationships. There was a question about avoiding rubber stamping. Some boards become with a characteristic or a term used as rubber stamping. If you go to a board meeting and you feel like the important stuff has been discussed already, the big decisions have been made already, and you're simply being asked to endorse them, that's what I would call rubber stamping. There is nothing about rubber stamping that has to do with steering or guiding the organization. People who are serving on boards that are more like a rubber stamping board typically do not feel a real strong sense of purpose, that they're making a real difference, because they're out of those discussions, they're out of those deliberations, they're happening somewhere else between other people. So if your board feels to you like you're rubber stamping, I would encourage you to simply bring it up. What are some ways that we can be more engaged and more involved in the deliberations before decisions get made? And that's a good question, and part of this workshop, I think, will address that as well. A third question that came up had to do with agendas, and agendas, I think, being perhaps too cluttered, too many things on the agenda. I'm trying to find the question here, so please be patient with me. Too many labeling of items on the agenda. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Let me share a quick comment with you about meeting agendas. You may recall at the very beginning of this webinar, before we looked at the agenda, we looked at the goals and the objectives. When you plan your board meetings, if you begin by looking at what are the objectives, what is going to get accomplished at this meeting, and from that develop your agenda. Your agenda becomes simply the way you allocate the time you're going to spend on what particular issues. But one of the ways that people do their agendas is that they'll attach names to certain agenda items. So, for example, if there's going to be a financial report, next to that you may attach the name of the person who's the treasurer. If there's a fundraising report, you may attach the name of the person who's heading up the fundraising task force. So if there's an executive director report, obviously the name you would attach to that item would be the executive director. So there's some thoughts about that. The other thing you might think about in terms of labeling agenda items is that some things you will talk about at a board meeting because you need to be informed, because you want to generate some new ideas. And those are kind of informational items. There are also issues you will talk about at a board meeting that are decisional. We are going to discuss and debate, and then we are going to make a decision. And so by labeling each agenda item, whether it's informational or decisional, is often a good way to clarify the expectations as you go through your meeting. So there's just some thoughts on labeling. And again, this is from Joe. So Joe, if you have more to your question, please get back to me in an email, and I will do my best to get to it. And the other question that I didn't get to yet is about fundraising. Fundraising is something I think that one person is saying is something that their board does not do that well. And fundraising is something that's always a challenge for many boards. And we've done, and on a website actually at the CUI, there's a webinar on fundraising. So that may be something you might want to look at. And again, that's archived there. And I'm also seeing that I may have misread, or there was a typo around the question, and it wasn't labeling, it was tabling. And tabling, I will quickly share with you, is a parliamentary procedure that you would make to take an agenda off the table, to simply say, we're not going to discuss this. And when an item gets tabled, it gets put in some black hole somewhere. If you find yourself having to table items on your agenda with any kind of frequency, it may be an indication that you could plan your meetings a little better and be a little clear about whether it's your business and whether it's the right time for this business. Sometimes issues will come up that will distract you from the plan of the meeting, and some of those can be deferred to another meeting, and you can simply determine as a board, let's take that up at the next meeting, and make a note of that, and then make sure that you attend to that when you do meet the next time around. So I think I've covered those questions for now, the best I can for now. I'm going to shift gears back to the board building cycle, and you can see this as a cycle. One of the thoughts on preparing this is that it's a cycle that has a beginning where you identify people and you cultivate them and you recruit and bring them on. You give them work to do. You help educate them. They learn. They evaluate their own work. They rotate off the board. And from time to time, you take the time it takes to celebrate the accomplishments of the work. Board work is never ending. This cycle is never ending. That doesn't necessarily mean that board service should be a life sentence. So when you ask people to go on your board, giving them an idea of what the job is and how long they're expected to make a commitment, you can always renew that commitment depending on your bylaws. But having a sense of when does the service begin and when does it end is a good thing. So this is the cycle, and we're going to go through these and touch on some of these points. We're going to focus a lot of our time on recruitment, because that's what comes through often in evaluation as an area to improve. So we'll move along here, and we'll look at identifying. So when you're looking at your board and you think about how do we identify people, who are good people to come onto our board, what kind of skills do we need to round out our board, what kind of connections can people bring, what kind of talent, what kind of mix of styles do we need? But your first step is always to identify that, and that means you begin by looking at where you are. You have to take that very first step. What do we need to move forward, and what do we have? And then what's missing? So those are kind of the steps in the identifying phase. When you're identifying, you're thinking about the way people bring value to your board meetings and to your board. They bring value beyond their simple roles. For example, you may decide we need somebody to come on our board who's a lawyer. Well, to bring somebody on your board who's a lawyer, you're bringing somebody on in the role of a lawyer. But lawyers bring value that often goes beyond their legal expertise. Lawyers often bring intellectual value. Lawyers are the kind of people that are good at taking complex discussions and distilling them down to like the essential points. So as you think about the kind of value or the kind of capital that people can bring, it fits under these kind of categories almost all the time. Intellectual value, resources, somebody who can help you raise money or bring money, resources going beyond that. I had worked with a client where a board member had a large company, and he gave to the nonprofit the use of an entire floor in his office, with the desks, the computers, the phone lines, all of that. A tremendous resource for a nonprofit, and one that was not about money so much as giving what he had at his disposal. Reputation is really important. Some people can bring reputation. If you had someone on your board who was highly regarded in the community, their reputation by associating with you, you would benefit from that. And access has to do mostly with the kind of advocacy work you do. And nationally, you have NCUIH as one of your advocacy arms. NCUIH has access to those decision makers in Washington. In your communities, there are decision makers, and if it's important to you to have access to them, bringing someone on your board who has that access is a good thing. Cultivating potential donors. How do we bring people into our family? And you think about this, you're identifying sources of potential board members with the kind of characteristics that you need. What kind of expertise do we need in financial management, for example, or in nonprofit governance, or healthcare administration? What are the kind of specific skills? And if you think about it, that's what you want to do, is to cultivate those people. And you cultivate them by developing relationships with them, getting to know them. Inviting someone, considering bringing someone on your board is about asking them if they want to be in a working relationship with you and with every other board member and with your staff. Cultivating is about getting them interested and keeping them informed. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is why it matters. One of the things I find with some urban programs is that they have a hard time attracting business people, and they know that business people in the community can bring some real value. One of the ways you can cultivate business people is to go to the places where business people go. For example, a chamber of commerce. If it's important for your program to have people with some business expertise serving on your board, you might consider, for example, joining the Chamber of Commerce, getting to know people, building those relationships. So those are ways to kind of cultivate. We come around the cycle now, we're coming to recruitment. What are the ways in which we recruit the people that really will bring the greatest value to our organization? There are just some basics around recruitment, and I'll share with you kind of an unconventional way to think about recruitment. But you've got to describe to the person what you want, what you need. This is, in a sense, saying, here's a job description. These are the expectations we have. Invite their questions in the recruitment process. Recruitment is like interviewing somebody for a job. It's a two-way conversation. Don't minimize requirements. One of the worst kind of downward spirals boards can get in is when they say, and you may have heard yourself saying this, I'd like you to come on the board. It's not going to take a lot of time. It's not a lot of work. Well, that may really be minimizing the requirements. Board service does take a lot of time. It is very important. It is about doing a lot. And if people are doing a lot and it's making a difference, they'll keep their sleeves rolled up and they'll keep working. And making sure that the person understands and supports your mission. That's the obvious one. You can't bring someone onto your board if they don't feel a real passion for your mission. Passion for your mission is like love. It's something that's essential, but it's not enough. So in addition to passion, people have to bring some other kind of skills, some other kinds of values. There's an interesting way to think about recruitment, and this comes from a woman named Jan Masaoka. And she calls this critical path recruitment. So here's another way to think about recruiting people to your board. Boards are like baseball. Both are team sports. Some things everyone has to do. So if you're on a baseball team, you have to wear the uniform. You have to attend practices. Some things only one or two people have to do. You only need one shortstop. You don't need 9 shortstops. So when you think about boards and baseball, some things everyone has to do, some things are more specialized. And when you compare this to board work, some things that everyone has to do, everyone on your board has to show up, have to attend meetings, have to make a contribution if that's a requirement in your organization. There's some things that everybody does, but there are some things that not everybody can do or ought to do. Understanding finance is one of those. Making a connection to your organization with a prospective ally. Not everyone can do that, but somebody maybe can. So, when you ask someone to come on your board, you're asking them to do some things that everyone does and some things that only certain people will do. So in her way of thinking about this, the typical start when you're looking to recruit people, you go to the first question in autopilot, who do we know? A strategic start is more about what are the two most important things this board needs to accomplish. Very different way of beginning. If you follow the critical path of recruitment, you start down with what are the organization's priorities, and you establish objectives for the board. And then based on those, you recruit. And when you bring somebody on, they already know that there's a job for them. They feel a real sense of purpose. So again, to kind of recap this way of kind of thinking about recruiting, you decide what's important, what's the job that's got to get done that this one person can do. And when they come on the board, they know that's their job. It's something they can do. They agree to it. They feel a sense of purpose. They will make a difference. And when the time comes that they decide to cycle off your board, they can look back and say, yeah, they came, they brought some value. There's something here that's better now as a result of it, and now I can cycle off. So it's an interesting way to think about recruiting, a little bit different than the more conventional way. And it's a way to get you out of autopilot as you think about recruiting. We're coming around the cycle now, and we're looking now at orientation. Orientation is something that's really important. People come onto a board, they have to be oriented not only to the organization, but to be oriented to the board. How does a new person get to know what's this board like? What's the kind of work this board's been doing? Who are these board people? How do I find a way to fit into this board? Orientation is really a key. And the more you invest early on in orienting people, the faster they can bring value and the more they'll feel valued. Orientation is ongoing. It's not something you have an orientation meeting and it's done. Orientation is something that's ongoing, and everyone on the board shares responsibility for it. Doing orientation in a formal, fast-track way is one of the most significant trends in the nonprofit sector now. Getting people in and up to speed, the sooner you get them in and up to speed, the sooner they can bring value, and the sooner they'll feel valued. Some ways you can do that, having a board manual is a good way to shortcut a lot of things. Imagine a new person coming into your board. They have to know a lot in a very short period of time. A board manual is often a helpful way to do that. Having a tour of the facilities, a mentoring program, or a buddy system. These strategies work really well in getting new people in and up to speed as quickly as possible. Having an orientation meeting is another one. In an orientation meeting where you actually think about who you might invite. If someone is new coming onto your board, it might be nice for them to meet some of the key staff, maybe some clients or former clients. Help them get a better understanding of who you are, what you do, why it matters, and how they are going to contribute to the mission. Involving comes the next phase. What are the ways in which you involve people? Give them things to do. Determine what they're interested in. Look for things that people are interested in and able to do and like to do, and find a way to connect them. I think about involvement as kind of a matter of fit. You want to make a good fit here. I think of an example. I had when I was running an agency, and we wanted somebody to come on our board with some financial expertise, and I had a conversation with a woman who was a bank manager. And the first thing she said was, I'll come on the board, but I don't want to be on the finance committee. That's her skills. That's her skill set, but that's what she does 8 to 5. She wanted to come on the board and do some other things. And so we found a place for her. So that's an example of trying to get a good fit. And then, of course, expressing appreciation for the work that people do. Having effective meetings is a good way for people to feel involved and be involved and feel like they're making a difference. And again, you have effective meetings by evaluating your meetings every time you meet, looking for ways, looking for feedback from everyone around the table about how could we do better? How could we be more effective? We move around this cycle now to educating. Educating the board and each board member. What are the key issues facing your organization? Look at urban Indian health programs now in this country. You have to be looking at the Affordable Care Act. You have to be looking at changes in third-party reimbursements. You have to be looking at the expectations around quality assurance. These are big issues, and you want to get your board members educated about them as quickly as possible. And if you're having challenges, get them out there. Don't hide the difficulties. Get them out there. People often get charged up and energized when there's some difficulties, when there's some things that they could do to really make a difference. Assigning responsibility to promote learning. People can learn on the job when they come onto the board. If you have someone that comes on your board and you'd like them to be the secretary and they've never been a secretary, that may be a good reason to ask them to be a secretary. Give them a chance to learn how to do that job. We come around now to evaluating, and this is really a key thing. Boards that perform at a high level pay attention to the way they do their work and always strive to improve. Assessing your board and its performance on a regular basis. What are the things we do well? What are the things that we don't do so well? And how can we improve on that? Encouraging individual self-assessment. Inviting every board member to reflect on the past year and ask, how could I have been a better board member? What are some things that I didn't do that I should have done? How can I be more effective here as a board member? And identifying ways to improve. When you take the notion of self-assessment, whether it's the board looking at its own self-assessment or individual board members, it really requires some courage, because you are actually saying, I'm going to take an honest look at myself, and I don't know what I'm going to find, but I'm going to take an honest look, and I'm going to be open to what I find, and considering the areas that may not look so pretty, and find some ways to get better in those areas. That's the evaluation section. And then we come to rotating. Your board is a dynamic thing. As I said earlier, one of the themes, your board is an ongoing action word. It's not a noun. Thinking about ways in which we can ensure that we renew our board over time. I know in my experience working with Native programs and other Native organizations, it doesn't necessarily mean term limits. I know that the term limits can be emotionally charged with some folks, and I'm not at all suggesting you should or shouldn't have term limits. I'm simply saying if you want to have a healthy board, you have to find a way to bring in new people and to thank people who've given a lot and give them a chance to get off and get some rest, perhaps. So that's the kind of rotating part of this. And it also has to do with developing new leadership with intention. Your board has to be comprised of a mix of people, diversity at every dimension, and one of those dimensions is young and old. Having a great regard and respect for elders is central to urban programs. You also have to ask questions of how do we honor our elders and keep spaces for them on our board and still find space to bring in new people, because we want our young people to come into these organizations as trustees as well. It's a real challenge for most organizations, and in my experience, it's a particular challenge for Native American organizations. It takes a lot of creative thinking and wisdom to come up with some ways to do it, but it's probably there. You just need to dig for it. And then finally, we come to the kind of wrap up of this webinar, and that's this notion of celebrating. If you were to take once a year some time at a board meeting and just reflect on the past year and really acknowledge and celebrate the work that you did do, all that good work, perhaps the difficult period you came through, talk about how your clients may be better a year now that you've been on the board for a year. But looking at taking the time to celebrate is something that boards often forget to do. We get so caught up in the business, and it's important to celebrate. It's important to step back and acknowledge all that's gone before. So that's like the fifth, that's the end of the kind of building cycle. So there I kind of covered this whole notion of celebrating, the kind of 9 steps or phases in the board building cycle. I would welcome your thoughts and reflections, and I would invite you to share those thoughts and reflections to my email address, which is down here, tscucci@proctor.com. Please feel free to do that. If anyone on the call has a thought or a comment or question, if you want to type it in the chat box, we have a few minutes, and I could respond to them. So please take a moment and do that. And while you're reflecting on this past hour, um, I would also invite you to think about the evaluation that will be coming along once we wrap this up. So let me just once again invite any other questions or comments. Somebody wanted to type something into the chat box? Okay, well, I'm gonna take that as a people have gotten probably a lot of information. I wish we had some opportunity to have more conversation. It's one of the downsides of a webinar. I hope this did have some value for you. And if you again would like to get back to me with anything, please use that email address. And now I think Kimberly is going to take over the screen and put up a slide. That will reflect the next webinar and invite you to come to that as well. So Kimberly, if you would do that, I'd appreciate it, and I will thank you, Kimberly, for being my support person through this whole webinar.
Thank you, and thank you all for attending this webinar from the National Council of Urban Indian Health. I would like to invite you to the next upcoming Board of Directors training. This is a 5-part series, and the next training will be on February 17th on board assessment. But also keeping in mind, if there are those that are interested in our executive directors training that will be occurring as well, the next scheduled or the first session in that director's training series, it's actually coming up on next Tuesday, January 21st. So if you are interested in participating on that call, please feel free to register. The link is showing on your screen right now, but you also should receive a message that contains that registration link as well. So just keeping in mind that there are 2 concurrent series going on, the Board of Directors training as well as the Executive Directors training series. So once again, we appreciate you in attending our webinar, and you will be receiving a link for registering for these series as well as a link for an evaluation to this webinar that just completed. We would appreciate your feedback. It does help us in determining new strategies and new ways of presenting information to you, as well as new topics. And with that, we have a few more minutes. If there are any questions, please feel free to type into your question box, and we could get to those. Tony, there actually is one question. Um, if you can see it. If not, it says, is the PowerPoint available? So I also will be sending out the PowerPoint in a follow-up email to all those that have attended the webinar today. So you'll be receiving the webinar PowerPoint as well as the link to the archive recording of this webinar. It will take us a minimum of about a week in order to get that information out to you, but it will be forthcoming.
Well, thank you again, Kimberly. I really appreciate your support and all this.
No problem.
Have a good day, everybody.